from rival researchers. At this time, foreign researchers who shared an increasing interest in Chinese architectural history had already begun to make some remarkable progress in this field. Among the first scholars attracted to Chinese architecture was the 18th century British royal architect Sir William Chambers. Chambers was very curious and inquisitive, and his book, Design for Chinese Buildings, Furniture, Dresses, Machines, and Utensils, ignited a China fever throughout Europe. Thereafter, Swedish scholar Oswald Sirens' The Walls and Gates of Peking, French scholar Emmanuel-Edouard Chavannes' Mission archéologique in China septentrionale, French scholar Paul Pellois' Le Grotto de Tuan Huang, and German scholar Ernst Borschmann's China, Architecture and Landscape followed suit. These works significantly promoted the field of sinology in the West. The footprints of these scholars were all over China.
But they didn't really study the buildings. But I think they made a very important contribution on Liang Sicheng. Perhaps the major contribution of these people was their photography. And I think this was an awakening for Liang to come to the United States and say, foreigners have come to my country and photographed buildings in my country that my own people don't know about. Now it's time for China to understand this as Chinese.
Liang felt pressured to expedite his research, as he learned that Japanese scholars had already carried out extensive and detailed studies of Chinese architecture. At the opening ceremony of the Institute, Zhu Chichang invited several Japanese scholars, one of whom was Ito Chuta, the father of Japanese architecture. Before the 19th century, the family tree of world architecture in Western eyes was dominated by the Greeks and Romans, from whom all other systems of architecture were derived. That Chinese and Japanese architecture were but offshoots of this tree enraged Japanese scholars. Japan had learned the art of ancient architecture from China, but not unlike China, it had ignored its own historical relics. The attitude of the Japanese didn't change until the mid-1800s.
外国人来了，西洋人来了，认为日本的东西、寺庙什么东西非常爱好。有些人就把寺庙卖给外国人。后来因为日本人慢慢知道有价值。
That is the main reason Japanese government realized we have to do something about to protect our culture.
In 1897, the Japanese government passed the Ancient Temple Conservation Act and launched a national survey. In Nara, the Horyuji Temple complex was discovered. Its wooden construction, with an alleged history of 1,300 years, became a national treasure. Japan announced its resolve to separate from Asia and to join Europe. However, in the cultural arena, Japan maintained utmost nationalistic pride.
We have to thank to those particular two persons who started to study about the history of Japanese arts, and also particularly Ito Chuta and other scholars who started to study on Japanese architecture. Those particular scholars started to pay attention to its Japanese own history in the field of arts and architecture.
In the year that Liang Sicheng was born, 1901, China was engulfed in the Boxer Rebellion when the eight-power Allied forces overpowered Beijing. Ito Chuta went to China, and with all the conveniences imaginable, he examined the imperial architectural complex of the Forbidden City. the Japanese photographer Ogawa Kazuma and his team produced a detailed photographic record of their research. Thereafter, Ito Chuta made many more visits to China to conduct more thorough research on Chinese architecture. Back then, cameras were both heavy and costly. Thus, Ito Chuta relied on his illustrated journals to record what he learned in China, in preparation for his book, A History of Chinese Architecture.
这个画册是他伊东充太去中国1902年去考察的时候，他就一直带着自己画的比较宝贵的东西。東中太が中国に関心を持ったのは、中国が好きであったからではなくて、日本の建築が西洋と同じ程度に進歩しているということを証明するために中国を調査したんですね。ですから先ほどの最初の質問に戻ると、伊藤忠太がなぜ中国に行ったかというと、西洋のギリシャから日本に伝播したものを証明するために、その中間にその痕跡が残っているかということをずっと探し出そうとしたんですね。
Later, a number of Japanese architectural historians traveled throughout China. In addition to Chinese architecture, they also studied the grottos and Buddhist cultural relics. They were determined to prove that Japanese architecture and European architecture were endogenous. In the archives of the Department of Architecture of the University of Tokyo, there are many research materials belonging to those Japanese scholars who conducted research in China on the ancient architecture.
这是那个关野真先生当时他在中国调查的，这是沈阳，然后他拿回来以后，在当时他们建筑系把它整理作为教材。
Only a few decades after the first field trips, the scale of devastation of Chinese relics is astonishing. Since our culture can be traced back to China, the Japanese government and scholars should immediately request that the Chinese government make efforts to conserve its architectural relics. Meanwhile, Japanese researchers should make haste to collect these relics from the various periods of Chinese history and establish museums in Japan to preserve them. The extant national treasures abound in China. On the one hand, China remains ignorant of their significance and value. On the other hand, their ignorance will keep them from valuing these relics, which should really be the responsibility of our Japanese scholars.
那时候就保护的也不太好，非常不好。在他的笔记本里头这样写的，所以唐代是最好。他们认为唐代日本的东西都是唐代的东西后代，所以他们对唐代的东西有兴趣，其他好像没有什么兴趣。
When the Institute for Research in Chinese Architecture, the first organization devoted to the study of architectural history in China, was established, Japanese scholars had completed their first stage of research on Chinese architecture. In 1925, Ito Chuta completed his book on Chinese architectural history. It ended with Tang architecture, which according to him had the most profound influence on Japan and was the crown of Chinese architecture. This was Ito's version of Chinese architectural history.
所以日本的学者介入，就有一个非常大的不同，就让中国这些学者认识到，就是当时他们讲过一些话，就是有可能我们的自己的这种学问完全被人家拿走，就是我们自己最后自己说不清楚。因为日本的很多学者，像长盘大定啊， 管野真啊、伊东忠太啊，他们的研究水准，平心而论还是比较高的。就从今天来看，很多论点都还是很有价值。最明显的是，当时来讲，跟当时的欧洲人比，要高出一截，要高出一截。所以这个刺激就非常，我认为是非常直接的，所以导致中国的这些学者就已经不能再等待下去。
At the opening ceremony of the Institute, Ito Chuta, then in his 60s, delivered a speech on Chinese architecture. He raised some suggestions that exasperated the Chinese scholars. To achieve such a majestic feat, undoubtedly the task rests on the shoulders of the Chinese people. We Japanese, however, also feel a responsibility to participate, since, as already mentioned, Japanese architecture is much indebted to its Chinese origins. Hence, I suggest that Chinese scholars should focus on documentary studies and Japanese scholars should focus on a study of the relics. I would like to know if this is feasible. Ito Chuta suggested that since Chinese academic traditions did not contain any elements of archaeology or fieldwork, and China